Jim has been around farms all of his life in the seed business, agronomist for over 20 years, if I know right.
30. We're up
I was
to 30.
trying to help you out, make you a little younger. So.
I know, sorry.
Come on out here, Jim, and give these guys a good session. The title of his talk is Green, the Color of Yields and Money. And so I'm anxious to have you listen to Jim. Thanks,
All right,
Jim.
great. Thanks, Greg. So again, my name's Jim Schwartz. Let's see, I grew up in the southwest corner of Indiana, a little town called Huntingburg. Graduated from Purdue with a double major in plant pathology and euchre. And I like the euchre part a lot better. 30 years of experience in the seed business. I'm reminded of a comic strip I saw when I was a kid, and I've never forgot. Little Orphan Annie, and one day Little Orphan Annie is talking to Daddy Warbucks, and she said, "Daddy Warbucks, how did you get so smart?" And he said, "Through experience." And she said, "Well, how did you get so much experience?" And he said, "By making mistakes." So I frankly have made more mistakes than most people, and that's how I got there. So, all right, this is a picture of my family, 2 of my 3 boys. As Greg said, it stinks to be 6'3" and the smallest boy in your family. And both those boys are taller than me. However, I coach them in basketball, so I tell them that every 2 inches they grow, I become that much smarter of a basketball coach as well. So now please note, in the middle, there is a miniature Yorkshire Labrador Retriever. So that is my dude. Now, Tim, I don't see my next slide. Did you put my next slide in? Oh, I had a great one, another picture. But anyhow, that is my miniature Yorkshire Labrador Retriever. The guy goes with me everywhere, and unfortunately, he passed away this past fall. And the worst mistake, I'm going to see if I can find, there it is. That is the worst mistake I've ever made in my life. So I replaced my miniature Yorkshire Labrador Retriever with 2 miniature Yorkshire Labrador Retrievers. And oh my goodness, I had no clue how much damage 9 pounds of dog flesh can do. So having said that, I'd like to announce a door prize for today. And there will be a box with holes in it at the back, and you can just take it, okay? So just don't tell my wife. All right. So I'm going to talk to you today. If you remember the movie Wall Street, and Michael Douglas says greed is good. Well, what I'd like you to know after we're done today is that green is good. I really want to talk to you about plant health, but specifically more about plant health during grain fill, why it's so important to keep those plants alive during the grain fill period, keep them filling that ear. And I really want to talk about it. It's intuitive, but I want to share a little bit. Before I do, I've got a chart up here that shows yields since 1965. That's the red line. And if you notice, they've doubled. Then I've overlaid, this is from the USDA. The blue line is nitrogen usage over that same time frame. And what do you notice about it? It's pretty much plateaued, right? So this is the audience participation part of my talk. I'd like you to tell me, why has that blue line plateaued? Why have we stabilized our nitrogen rates such that they're not growing at the same rate of corn yield? Somebody share with me. It's expensive. What else? Exactly. We're more efficient. Completely agree. Anything else? The environment, water quality, things like that. Those are things that come back a lot, right? It's more expensive. We're doing a better job with it. Completely agree. And water quality issues. Now, as yields continue to grow, we're going to need to think about this and how we continue to get better and continue to be more efficient with our nitrogen usage as we move forward. This graph, unfortunately, I apologize, you're going to see it about 52 times, but it's important because what this graph represents is nitrogen uptake in the life of a corn plant. Interestingly enough, if you look after V14, V16, somewhere in that area, corn plant still takes up over 50% of its N, and that big yellow area, that's the grain fill period. So in other words, there's a lot of nitrogen taken up late in the life of a corn plant to fill grain. Interestingly, though, when do we put on most of our N? Right here. So, is that the whole story? Things are changing. I told you that I think that's a nitrogen uptake curve, and it is, but we think hybrids are changing as well as yields increase. I'll read this to you in just a second. This is from Fred Below, Dr. Fred Below at University of Illinois. Many of you know him. And I thought this was very interesting. I'd like to read this to you. Nutrient uptake measurements from studies conducted nearly 50 years ago, okay? And they've compiled data over all that time. And go to the underlined part. The apparent increase in post-flowering nutrient accumulation in this study may be attributable in part to greater dry matter production during late reproductive development, along with reduced leaf senescence of modern hybrids. In other words, one of the things they're discovering is that hybrids are beginning to take up more nutrients later in the growing season. So maybe that chart I showed you is right. Maybe it's shifting a little bit as well. This is from Pioneer. The study says, but we know today's hybrids are taking up more total N than previous hybrids over the entire season. The demand for N post-flowering is greater than it used to be. So maybe that chart is changing. Hybrids are taking up more N. Yield levels are going up. So maybe things are changing just a little bit. I was at a meeting this summer, and there was a gentleman named Dr. Jerry Hatfield from the NRCS, Iowa State University, and he gave a presentation. And he introduced this concept called the senescence index. I'd never seen it before in my life. And I walked up to him after the presentation and said, Dr. Hatfield, never seen that senescence index before. And he said, well, there's a reason for that. This is the first time I've ever shown it to anyone. And it's brand new, and I developed it. And here's the concept. Basically, I'll show you the data here in a second. It says the longer we can maintain green leaf area during grain filling period, the higher the yield. That sounds intuitive, but nobody had ever really documented it before. Well, here's 3 years of data that he did. He took a lot of time to document this. And as you look at those three charts, those are 3 different years, right? 08, 09, and 2010, they basically document there is a straight line relationship between keeping that plant healthy during grain fill, keeping its senescence, in other words, its die down, as a regulated process as opposed to die down, and grain yield. All right? This is from DeKalb Asgrow. This was one of their growing newsletters, and I thought it was very interesting. I pulled this out of there. During the grain fill stage, any stress on the photosynthetic process can reduce yield potential. Gives a number of factors there that can impact it, including nitrogen. That last paragraph there. After pollination, corn plants redirect carbohydrate movements to fill the developing kernels while sacrificing the health of the stalks, leaves, and roots. And that's very, very true. You all know what this is. This is a corn plant. Now, that corn plant has a warehouse. Does anybody know where the warehouse for that corn plant is? Right there. As it grows, it stores, all right, it stores carbohydrates, it stores nutrients down in the bottom of that stalk for later use if need be. Think about in the spring, when you see a nitrogen deficiency, or it can be any time of the year. When you see a nitrogen deficiency, where do you see an N deficiency show up on the corn plant? Anybody? Lower leaves, right? Why do they show up on the lower leaves? What's happening? N is a mobile nutrient in the plant. So what the plant is doing is it's taking from the warehouse and it's moving the N up into the actively growing areas of the plant, okay? Either the meristem or the ear. So it's pulling out, it's remobilizing, cannibalizing, you've heard the term cannibalizing, those nutrients and putting them into the actively growing parts of the plants. That's the warehouse of the plant. Now, I'm going to get up on my soapbox for just a second because I hear all the time and it drives me nuts. For those of you here this summer, you heard me talk about nitrogen credits from soybeans and why that drove me nuts. This is another one where I hear yield is determined between, V6 and V12 or whatever. No, it's not, right? It's not. What's determined between V6 and V12? Somebody, anybody? Maximum yield, right? Not yield. Maximum yield is what's determined during that stage, not yield. And I'll prove it to you. This is a chart that shows, you've all seen this probably, yield loss if we have a severe frost or a freeze, right? Basically, if you look up there, you can see the different growth stages. If we have a hard freeze at blister, what's our yield? It's nothing, right? It's 0. Now, there's a reason I'm showing this to you, because what I want you to understand is the importance and the contribution of that corn plant to yield during this grain fill period. If we stop it, if we slow it, if we do anything to interrupt it, that's going to impact yield. So remember, my basic premise when we started is green is good. This is why green is good. We want to keep filling. There's so much that goes on during this grain fill process. We want to keep it going as long as we possibly can. Okay. My wife will tell you, in fact, she'll tell anybody, that I don't remember anything. And that's true. I cop to that. She would tell you that I can't remember when we got married. I don't remember anything about anything that's 2 or 3 days ago. That's probably true. However, she will tell you that I can remember growing seasons, and that's true. In fact, the way I remember the year we got married was we got married on Labor Day weekend, and the cold front came through, and it dropped to like 50 degrees and started snowing, and that was 1992, and it was a cool, wet year, and we had great yields and wet grain. That's how I remember the year we got married, because the growing season. So, and she hates that's how I remember it, but it works, right? It works for me. Does anybody remember 2010, the year 2010? I remember the year 2010. It was, and there's a reason why I'm sharing with you. I remember going with my family on vacation. We were driving across southern Ohio. It was late August, and I never in my life, 30 years of doing this, never before, never since, have I ever seen a dry down period let me rephrase that, a grain fill period as rapid as that year. Now, if you remember, Greg talked about 09, that wet fall. You remember he talked about running out of in spring of 10 because of what happened in 09 and a lot of late season applications. We had a really interesting set of weather conditions. And that grain fill period in 2010, that fall grain fill period was the fastest I have ever seen in my life, okay? I mean, hybrids went right through it. Well, there was a hybrid. In that year, I worked for a company. We introduced a trait with a hybrid in it. I worked in the germplasm side of the seed business back then. This piece of germplasm was a European hybrid. And European hybrids tend to like cooler growing seasons and cooler grain fill periods. The hybrid that we happened to introduce this new trait in, European background, its yield was about grain fill and kernel depth. It really relied on kernel depth to finish off its grain. Well, guess what? We introduced this hybrid in 2010. We had the shortest grain fill period we've ever had. The kernels were very shallow. The hybrid flopped. Some of you probably had it. It was terrible. Unfortunately, the trait got blamed for it, but it was terrible. And it was all because of that grain fill period and how much kernel depth it didn't get. And it just ruined the hybrid and darn near ruined the technology. But I share that with you because had we been able to keep that plant alive, had something been different, maybe it's nitrogen, maybe it was plant health, and kept it going during grain fill, it would have been a completely different story. All right, so bottom line, hybrids are changing. Remember those first couple slides I talked to you, Dr. Bilo talking about hybrids are accumulating dry matter later. Pioneer talked about hybrids are taking up in later. All right, let's say we accept that. But is there anything else changing? Anything else changing in our world around us as we farm? This is a chart that shows the U.S. trends in heavy precipitation over the last century. And if you look, you can see there's a real trend in heavy precipitation events in the U.S. Now, I'm not a polar ice cap guy. I frankly am very grateful for global warming. Otherwise, we'd be trying to farm glaciers, right? So I'm thrilled that we had global warming to melt the glaciers. And by the way, I have no idea what caused all that global warming, right? That melted the glaciers. But weather is changing. The patterns are changing. And here's another slide. All right, this is another slide that documents over the last century, I think it's really interesting data. In the upper Midwest, there's been nearly a 50% increase in 4-inch rainfall events. In other words, we've doubled the number of 4-inch rainfall events over the last century in the upper Midwest. It's fascinating how the weather is changing. Here's a slide from Iowa State University Climatology Group. And what they did was they took it, I think it's 1893 up there, 1893 to 1980 in the blue, and then 1980 to current day in the red. What they did is they clustered them. They basically said, what's the average, right? What are all the average years look like? Where do they fall? And they clustered them, and here's where they fell. For the most part, you can see some outliers. What I think is really interesting, and by the way, I should describe this better. This is May-June precipitation, lasts more. This is July-August precipitation, lasts more. What's fascinating is, if you look at, you can find the last 5 years up there, right? Unfortunately, 2012, but then look, 2010, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And where do they fall? They fall on the high end in rainfall, right? So maybe it's a new trend, maybe it's a new pattern, but if you go back and think of the prior two slides I showed you in this one, it's really evident, I think, that we're having more heavy rainfall events during the growing season. And most of you probably say, yeah, it's probably true. Now, Here's the other piece of that. This isn't news flash to anybody. For every inch and increase of rainfall over that normal, you're out of the field 3 days. All right? So the more of these heavy rainfall events, the more we're out of the field. So why is that important? Well, here's why it's important. What we've been doing, again, our standard practices, we put our nitrogen on here because that's what we can do. That's the equipment we have. It's what we've always done. That's the abilities that we have on our farm. Unfortunately, what we're learning now is that during this time frame, we have what? A whole lot more heavy rainfall events, all right? But yet, what are we learning about our hybrids? They're demanding more later. So there's a real disconnect, right? There's a real disconnect in what we're doing. So it looks like weather patterns are changing, but what are we doing to maintain a healthier plant? Because again, there's a disconnect. Weather's changing. More heavy rainfall, right? More of those events. And I think most of you'd say, it seems like that's the case. Hybrids are changing. So what are we doing to adapt? So here's the current practices, really. Much of our side dress is at that younger stage, but can we keep up? Can we really adapt as the world adapts around us, all right? Again, I told you you're going to see this like 542 times. Here it is. We've got to start changing. If this is shifting this way, and we're still doing it here, and we get all that rainfall here, what are we doing to change to adapt? I thought this was a really interesting quote from that same study. This is like a 30-some page study that Dr. Below conducted. And he talked about, in his conclusion, he put this paragraph in here. I thought it was really interesting. I'll just read it with you. As grain and biomass mass production has increased over the years, there's been at the same time an increased uptake of macronutrients and micronutrients. Therefore, there's a renewed need to evaluate and match nutrient availability with the time, amount, and method of supply, which most benefits sustainable production without harming the environment. Integration of new findings in key crops, including corn, will better allow us to achieve the fundamental goal of nutrient management, matching nutrient availability from soil and fertilizer methods with plant nutritional needs. What's he saying? Excuse me, what's he saying? He's saying things are changing, but we've got to figure out how do we get new methods, new ways of doing things to match the late season uptake he talked about, the different environments we have. What are we doing to start changing our systems to keep those plants alive and healthier later in the year? Again, remember, we talked about the longer you keep that plant alive, the longer you maintain that grain-filled period, the healthier you keep that plant and not cannibalizing itself, the higher the yields. Well, I think things are starting to change. I was in, as you heard Greg say, I was in the seed business 30 years. I loved it. Enjoyed every minute of it. It was fascinating. I worked in all kinds of different facets of the seed business. But one of the reasons I came here was that it was different. This is so different and so unique that every morning you wake up going, man, we can do something that's going to change agriculture. I think these two things we're just scratching the surface. You'll hear a lot more about Y drop and undercover, the ability to start doing something about our nitrogen programs, changing how and when, and undercover, the ability to start using plant nutrition products, whether it's fungicides, whether it's fertility, whether it's insecticides, using different products within a canopy to keep those plants alive and green later in the year. All right, this is a picture I took this summer. I wasn't smart enough. I should have just done it right down the road, but I thought I'd have a better picture of the ears. This is right down the road. This is me standing here and taking a picture with my phone this way, turning and take a picture this way. And if you don't believe me, the guy was here yesterday, was with me in the field, and he didn't jump up and shout I was a liar. But this is in Lafayette, Indiana. This is the same amount of N on the left as it is on the right. The only difference is we took 50 pounds. That's all up front. This is what the grower normally did. We took 50 pounds and we used a Y drop, and we side dressed, and on the right is the difference. Now, I will freely admit that this was kind of the acid test. This was a year because of all the rain we had. It favored what we do and how we do it. But this year was this year. This is the year we needed to worry about. As you can see, it was a huge difference. About 25 years ago, I had a pathologist from DeKalb Pfizer. I worked for DeKalb Pfizer back in those days. as an agronomist, and I had a pathologist tell me, and I've never forgotten it. He's one of the best pathologists I've ever been around. He said, Jim, the most important, the most stressful event in a corn plant's life. Anybody want to guess what the most stressful thing to a corn plant is? What he told me? Yield. He said yield is the number one stress a corn plant goes through. And we stress these plants. These hybrids are bred to yield. They are bred above anything and everything else to fill that grain. And guess what? Remember that picture of the plant I told you in the storehouse, the warehouse? They'll do everything they can to finish that grain. Here's a great example. This is a different picture. You'll see Jim Hedges. Now, Hedges is going to tell you I stole this picture from him. Just when he says that, just laugh or something, will you? Because it's not his picture. Well, maybe it is, but I just didn't want him to have that favor. But anyhow, so if you look, same thing. We took a field and we split it. You can tell on the right, your right, and on your left, same amount. Now, interestingly enough, anybody, you don't have to count, how many rows of kernels on the ears on the right? Anybody want to guess? 16. Anybody want to guess how many on the left? 16. It's the same number of rows of kernels. But look at the difference in that split application this year. Now, what I really want you to look at, though, is this right here. This is the stalk quality. This is the stalk quality of a laid in. So it really is talking about the importance of keeping those plants alive. Yes, it'll fill and it will give you good yields, but think about harvest loss now. Think about what happened in this plant, the kernel depth, the test weight, the grain quality versus here. And what this picture, I think I probably could have just gotten up here and shown you this picture, really illustrates the importance of keeping plants alive late in the year during grain fill so it doesn't have to cannibalize, it doesn't have to take out of the plant, and everything we do to keep it alive, filling grain, will really pay off in the bottom line. All right, let's review. 5 points. Hopefully you remember these. I can barely remember my birthday too. But here's what I want to do. Newer hybrids, right? Newer hybrids, as they say, they're using more fertility later in the year. All right, we talked about weather patterns are changing. We're seeing more heavy storms over the course of a growing season. The longer we keep plants green and alive, all right, the more we extend grain fill. That longer grain fill period is good for yield, and healthy plants cannibalize less and stand better. There's nothing, there's a verse in the Bible that says there's nothing new under the sun. I've not shared with you anything that's really new under the sun. It's really intuitive. But what is different and what is unique now is our ability to do something about it. We've never had that ability before. Now we do. Now you have the power in your hands to do something about it, to adapt and change. I'm a big fan of Henry Ford. I have a whole book of his quotes. I've always enjoyed Henry Ford, and I love this quote from Henry Ford. He said, "There is no progress in merely finding a better way to do a useless thing. Be ready to revise any system, scrap any method, abandon any theory if the success of the job requires it." I think that's where we're at today. I think that's where we're at in agriculture. But the difference is, it's changed. Now we have the ability, we have tools at our hands to scrap what we're doing and move to a better way. So just remember it, that again, plants, hybrids are taken up in later. We can do something about it now. We want to keep those plants green and healthy. It's good for yield. White drop and undercover are great tools to help you do that.